The last decade has seen a drastic deterioration of media freedoms around the world. In multiple countries and geographies, laws have been weaponized against independent journalism, leaving thousands of small publishers and journalists vulnerable to legal attacks that aim to censor their reporting and that deliver a lethal blow to their financial sustainability. Whether fighting criminal charges or civil lawsuits or challenging blocked social media accounts, legal representation is often the most effective tool to ensure that the media can continue their critical work uncensored and unhindered. Around the world, several organizations are providing support to reporters at risk, but more effective coordination is urgently needed. And that is why, together with our friends and partners at the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, and Media Defense, we are launching the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk. This network of networks comprising 15 media freedom organizations will strategically coordinate the different types of support currently offered with the goal of providing journalists and independent media outlets with a single entry point into a large ecosystem of support. Assistance offered through this network will range from urgent legal representation to ongoing assistance for the duration of a case to systemic support to improve the legal environment in which the media operates. The network will also produce legal practical tools that will help journalists navigating the ongoing complexities arising from legal measures used against them. The law should protect media freedom, not hinder it. But what are the common legal tactics that are being witnessed around the world to silence the media? What are the emerging hotspots, and what can be done to rapidly boost the legal support given to independent media so that the media can continue playing its vital role in strengthening democracy? Our next panel discussion will help answer some of these questions.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this insight session on defending media freedom. My name is Henriquez-Schmitz, and I'm the director of TrustLaw, the global legal pro bono program at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. At the Foundation, we're deeply committed to advancing media freedom through news, media development, free legal assistance, training, and convening initiatives. We combine our services to create a positive environment for media to operate independently and safely, and to improve the professional and business standards of independent media in countries at risk. We're delighted to be launching today the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk, together with our friends and partners, the Committee to Protect Journalists and Media Defense. This network, made up of leading freedom of expression groups and legal service providers, is a result of over a year of work that started with consultations we undertook in 2020 to explore how best to support journalists and media organizations in distress around the world through much needed legal assistance, litigation, and defense. In recent years, attacks against journalists have surged, and legal action targeting journalists or news outlets is increasingly used or threatened as a way to silence critical voices. From fake news, misinformation, or disinformation laws to national security and even tax laws, there are a number of new laws and new ways that laws are being used to curtail press freedom. The legal fees and potential damages resulting from these cases frequently threaten to bankrupt journalists and media outlets. And in today's landscape, journalists are often facing these legal threats alone, without the protection of well-resourced media houses or the financial ability to secure a good lawyer. At the same time, when journalists are assaulted or even murdered, the perpetrators are rarely prosecuted. These challenges have only been exacerbated as the COVID-19 pandemic has been used as an excuse to silence even more voices. The impact on media freedom has been nothing short of devastating. Legal threats and actions are crippling not only for the media, but for our democracies. Instead of being able to hold power to account, which is fundamental to any democratic society, journalists are facing extortionate claims for damages, criminal convictions, and in some cases, even prison sentences in the course of simply doing their public interest work. Although many organizations offer support for journalists at risk, including providing fees to cover legal expenses or pro bono representation, legal cases can be complex and enduring. In the face of the increased legal threats to independent media, more effective coordination is urgently needed to maximize the reach and impact of available legal support, to see cases through to their conclusion, and to improve the legal environment to support the independent media. The Legal Network for Journalists at Risk aims to fulfill this gap, aims to fulfill this role. The network will coordinate support to journalists and media outlets throughout the life of their cases. It'll more effectively leverage existing resources and will strengthen the ecosystem through the production of legal tools. Through today's Insight session, we'll learn more about the concrete legal challenges journalists are facing and the new and perversely creative ways in which the law is being used to hamper media freedom, as well as discuss the solutions and the opportunities to scale legal support for journalists so that they can continue their work, their critical work, safely and uncensored. So Alinda, Andrea, Keelan, Lucy, welcome, and thank you again for joining us today. Let's jump right in. Alinda, over the last decade, we've seen a drastic deterioration in media freedoms. What are the main challenges that journalists have been facing? What are you seeing from your work at Media Defense?
Thanks, Carolina. Journalists are indeed operating in a more difficult environment than ever. We're seeing this reflected in our work in an increase in requests for legal support every year. Last year, even we more than doubled our caseload. So there's definitely an increase in litigation that journalists are confronted with. And some of the main challenges that we're seeing is that journalists are, for instance, becoming victims of violence, both online and offline, often without an effective investigation taking place at the domestic level to identify who's responsible and to bring the perpetrators to justice. And this fuels a climate of impunity, which results in even more violence. So one of the things that we've been doing is try and help journalists take their governments to court to push for an effective investigation if they become victims of violence. Other challenges that we're seeing are that governments increasingly seek to control information online. We see a lot of blocking, filtering, internet shutdowns that we've heard about earlier in the conference as well. We see the introduction of an abuse of cybercrimes laws, fake news laws that are broadly drafted that are used to target legitimate journalism. Previously in our work, a journalist would, for instance, be prosecuted on charges of defamation in relation to a specific article, and in a way that would be an easier case to defend than the legal cases that we're seeing now. Right now, we're seeing critical journalists being imprisoned on the basis of false accusations that are much harder to fight. And these cases often go hand in hand with a smear campaign as well to discredit them and their journalism, as well as various criminal law measures to make their lives very difficult. For instance, travel bans of asset freezes that make it hard for them to do their journalistic work. And then one of the most damaging trends of all are slap suits intended to intimidate journalists and drain their resources. And these very costly and lengthy cases are very distractive from their journalistic work. And some of the most worrying trends that we're seeing is that there are not one or two hotspots. This trend is global, and we are seeing requests for support coming in from countries where we have never worked before, like countries in Western Europe or the US, which signals that this is increasingly a global problem.
Thank you, Alinda. That paints a pretty bleak picture, which is only made worse, I imagine, with the current crises that we're facing. With the sudden emergence of COVID-19, journalists and newsrooms are being called upon to provide the public with accurate and reliable information to navigate this complex and evolving topic. And despite that, the International Press Institute's, I think, COVID-19 Press Freedom Tracker found that there were close to about 700 press freedom violations linked to the pandemic coverage around the world. That includes arrests, charges, lawsuits, similar to what you were describing, Alinda. Lucy, can you tell us more about the role of journalists and the media in this era of COVID and how exactly the pandemic has exacerbated some of those challenges that they're facing?
I certainly can. Thank you so much, Carolina, and it's really lovely to be here today. So there is perhaps no better story than COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic to illustrate the importance of journalists and journalism in getting vital information to the public. Journalists, of course, played an absolutely vital role and continue to do so in telling the story of this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. And we have to remember that earlier last year, there was little information, and of course, we're still learning today, but journalists were tasked with providing information on public health, crucial information of public interest, while in some countries, reliable information from the government was not readily available. it did put journalists at risk, not only because of their personal safety, online and offline as well, but at the Committee to Protect Journalists, we identified many challenges to press freedom that exacerbated existing issues. So COVID exacerbated challenges such as laws against fake news, which Alinda has already mentioned, the jailing of journalists, suspending of free speech, those online and offline threats and harassment, and then restricted access to information, just to name a few. There were and continue to be legal threats to journalists covering COVID. Journalists charged with, for example, causing a public panic with Facebook posts around stories to do with COVID. And we are now dealing with, or journalists now are dealing with, of course, misinformation around COVID, around vaccines, mask mandates, and the consequences that that has on their personal safety as well. Of course, we have, in the middle of all of this, another story of massive public interest here in the United States, which was the protests last year around racial equality. And those protests really highlighted the lack of readily available information around journalists' legal rights here in the US, but globally also. Those protests were global. At the Committee to Protect Journalists, we receive requests for assistance and safety information all of the time. And the level of requests for information about basic legal protections around covering protests in the United States was, I would say, unprecedented. We, with TrustLaw, and I can speak more about this later, put together a really fantastic guide for journalists around this basic support, but it really shows that legal support and legal information is intrinsically tied to journalist safety. Alinda has already mentioned this as well, but with these crucial stories of public interest, the journalists are facing the new and evolving way that their safety is threatened, and that is, of course, with online harassment. We at the Committee to Protect Journalists see safety in kind of three overlapping ways: physical, digital, and psychosocial. And certainly with COVID, with protest coverage, all of those different types of safety risks have certainly come into play and have overlapped. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. It's clear from both what you and Alinda are describing that laws are being weaponized against journalists. And Caoilfhionn, perhaps in your experience representing a number of different stakeholders in this space, what are some of the creative ways in which laws are being used against journalists and media organizations to restrict media freedom? And perhaps we can go into a bit more detail on some of the examples that Alinda and Lucy have alluded to.
Thanks very much, Carolina. I mean, one of my clients, Maria Ressa, who many of you will have heard from yesterday, describes this as lawfare, weaponization of the law against journalists. And what we tended to see 15, 20 years ago was traditional weapons of lawfare, if I can put it that way, being used routinely against journalists. So defamation laws, for example, or terrorism or sedition laws. And certainly in my practice about a decade and a half ago, they were the kind of cases I was routinely seeing around the world, Egypt, Middle East, in Asia. I was tending to see the use of defamation laws, terrorism and sedition laws. Now, we still see those, of course, including the use of cyber libel laws, as Maria herself is facing, as well as traditional defamation laws. Or if you take the example of India, the archaic sedition law there was being used against journalists, but also environmental campaigners, students, and human rights activists earlier this year. And that's a law which penalizes anyone who invokes hatred or contempt or disaffection against the government, which is, of course, a blueprint for use against anyone who is a critic, which includes journalists and media organizations. Now, that's a colonial era law which was invoked in February 2021 against prominent journalists in India for their social media posts about ongoing anti-government protests by farmers. And importantly, the Supreme Court of India in June of this year quashed a sedition case against a particular senior journalist and asserted that every journalist was entitled to protection against the lodging of arbitrary cases. But that's a routine type of weapon we would see. One of my clients, Amal Fathi, in Egypt, for example, who's a journalist, a blogger, and a women's rights activist, posted on Facebook about her experience of sexual harassment and the ineffective response from the Egyptian government. And what she and her husband and her very young child then faced was a dawn raid at gunpoint and her being held for a period of time, ridiculously, on the basis of terrorism laws, on the basis that her speaking out and her having her Me Too moment was undermining the government in some way. So we still see those. What I'm increasingly seeing as a pattern is creative use of the law against journalists and using different weapons, which we haven't seen before. So increasingly what we're seeing is examples of bogus tax charges being brought, for example, against journalists, or increasingly I'm seeing the use of corruption laws against journalists. Now, they're particularly difficult because firstly, it's much harder if you're dealing with a securities regulator or a complex tax case or an espionage case to garner public support. It's much easier for the public to understand that a defamation law being used in a public interest case against a journalist is wrong. And it's much harder to get people to engage. As soon as you start talking about complex tax issues or financial transactions, it's much more difficult to get to the bottom of it. So it creates particular problems. There was an example which Reuters have given recently of their latest is an unfair competition criminal complaint, allegedly arising from their news reporting. But in fact, who was targeted was not their journalists, but their business legal representatives. So what we're seeing is the enemies of journalists and of freedom of expression and of the media are using the law in increasingly creative ways. And that's one of the reasons why this discussion today is so important, because I think in defending journalists from those onslaughts, we also need to be more creative and to think about different aspects of the law. Could I say one final thing at this stage, though, which is drawing on what Alinda and Lucy have already alluded to, it's very important that we don't only think of the weaponization of the law against journalists in a defensive way. Of course, in many of these examples that I've given, much of what we have to do as lawyers or as media freedom organizations is defensive. So Maria Ressa is currently facing 7 cases, 1 libel case, and an array of 6 other cases using a variety of bogus tax and financial charges against her, exposing her to a century in prison if convicted. And of course, we need to defend her. I need to defend Amal Fathi, and the lawyers representing the journalists in India need to defend them. But we also need proactive legal strategies, and particularly when we're dealing with the issue of impunity for violence against journalists and impunity in respect of cases involving the deaths of journalists, we need proactive legal strategies. It's not just about being reactive and defensive. And again, there, I think we should learn from our enemies. They're creative, they're using the law in creative ways, and we must do the same.
Thank you, Keelan. Great call to action there. I'll come back to that again a little later. But building on what you just touched on around impunity, I think that's a very important point. I'd like to turn to you, Andrea. From a global perspective, what are other important challenges or opportunities that you're seeing to defend media freedom today? I know that UNESCO has highlighted that impunity for crimes against journalists remains a global concern. You want to tell us a little bit more about UNESCO's work in that space, what kind of measures you're putting in place, what trends you're seeing?
Yes, thank you, Caroline, and the organizers for this invitation and for putting together this session. And greetings from UNESCO headquarters in Paris. Replying to the first part of your question about challenges, unfortunately, we confirm the figures given so far by previous speakers, based also on the UNESCO Observatory on Killed Journalists, which is also mandated to request the member states about the judicial follow-up. So some of the figures are that during the last decade, the number of assaulted or murdered journalists has steadily increased around the globe, over 950 journalists killed, with the persistence, as you mentioned, of widespread impunity. Roughly 90%, 9 out of 10 killings remain unpunished. Some other key trends, which were presented actually yesterday at the launch of the World Trend Reports on Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists and Media Development, which was launched here during the UNESCO General Conference, which is now ongoing, with the presence also of Nobel laureate Stiglitz. Some of these trends are there is increased number of journalists not killed outside conflict areas. Normally, in many cases, they are silenced for reporting on issues of corruption, crime, and politics. Another trend is, as mentioned also by previous speakers, related to the abusive judicial prosecutions, slaps, arbitrary detention, and also online harassment of women journalists. And there is a recent study which was presented by a colleague of mine, Guillermo Canella, in another panel of this conference. Last trend is the chilling effect of the global crisis caused by COVID-19 on freedom of expression. So in a time where, as said, press is more than ever has a pivotal role to play in informing the public, at the same time has seen an amplification of existing challenges, for instance, in terms of viability. So now we need not only to protect journalists, but also to protect journalism as a public good. Replying to the second part of your question about opportunity or response of partial remedies, we are really seeing an increased appetite from member states, in terms of need of training, sensitizing judges, judicial operators, prosecutors, and lawyers, of course. So, for instance, the UNESCO Judges Initiative, initiated about 10 years ago, has already trained over 23,000 judicial actors, judges, prosecutors, lawyers around the world, mostly in the global south. It started in Latin America and then has been expanding in Africa and in Asia. This training has been through massive online courses, but also on the ground, in partnership with regional courts on human rights, with publication, let me mention, which is available on our website, the Global Toolkit for Judicial Actors on International Legal Standards on Freedom of Expression, Access to Information, and Safety of Journalists. So, opportunity to engage with judges, but also to engage with prosecutors. For instance, we launched a guidelines for prosecutors on cases of crimes against journalists, which was developed together with International Association of Prosecutors. And then also the work with the civil society. And here we would like also to thank Alinda and the Media Legal Defense for having worked together with us on developing a publication on helping to prepare amicus curiae, the guide for to support grassroots organization, lawyers who are considering intervening on freedom of expression cases before national or international courts. So there is an opportunity to expand on these activities and to sensitize as much as possible the relevant stakeholders of the judicial process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. And such an important point, reflecting on the role of judicial actors in supporting, protecting, defending media freedom. Alinda, so we've discussed a number of ways in which legal attacks are being deployed against journalists with impunity. How do we tackle this growing challenge? And what role do you see the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk playing in supporting these journalists and media outlets?
Thanks, Carolina. I think the most important thing to remember is that effective legal support can make a real difference to the outcome and the duration of a case. We've heard that cases against journalists can be very complex. They can take many years. They can be very expensive. And many forms of support may be necessary over the course of a case. The support is available from various organizations, but it can be quite difficult for journalists to know where to start, or which organization to reach out to while they are also involved in defending these cases against them. The Legal Network will help make the best possible use of available resources. It will maximize the reach and the impact of the support that is available from various organizations. For instance, the network will look out for journalists who need legal support and connect them to a reliable lawyer, which might help them decide to fight a case rather than to take down their article. The network will coordinate financial support to help cover legal fees, so journalists don't have to pay for a lawyer. They can be connected to a reliable lawyer, and the legal fees will be taken care of by support organizations. The network can help strengthen legal representation. So, for instance, sometimes the only lawyer who's able to take on a case in a specific domestic context is a lawyer who does not have a media law background. Or there are various forms of support available to those lawyers to help improve the legal representation of journalists, or perhaps to connect them to a pro bono firm to make sure that they have some backup support. In addition, the network will coordinate any kind of efforts by different organizations to help strengthen a journalist's case. For instance, we could arrange for trial monitoring. There could be a joint amicus brief that raises the profile of the case or highlights international human rights standards that apply to the case. Organizations in the network could coordinate to reach out to international human rights mechanisms, for instance. And finally, the network would strengthen the media freedom ecosystem, for instance, by sharing resources that are available, legal tools, by training of lawyers that are defending the media. Ultimately, we would have a stronger ecosystem to defend the media whenever they get into legal trouble as a result of their work.
Thank you, Alinda. And collaboration is really essential to how we add value through this network and drive impact. And it's certainly essential to the success of the network in deploying that assistance. In many ways, the legal network is building on the great work of the Journalists in Distress network, which provides direct assistance to journalists and media workers. Lucy, can you tell us a little bit more about this network and how member organizations collaborate, how you see potentially these two networks working together?
Absolutely, yes. So prior to the launch of the legal network for journalists at risk, many members are already members of the JID network, or the Journalists in Distress network. And part of our safety work at CPJ is, of course, providing assistance to journalists at risk, whether that is legal support, of course, but also relocation support, medical support, trauma support increasingly, as well as safety information. And the JID network is a crucial part of that. And you're right, we could not do this work without the collaboration that we have with our partner organizations. So the JID network provides a really wonderful template for the legal network for journalists at risk, and the legal network will expand on the great work that we already do. So just to use an example of kind of how the JID network would currently work and how those partnerships are currently working, CPJ might have written an alert about a journalist who's facing legal threats because of the work they're doing. And that journalist will come to us and say, okay, I need assistance with paying my legal fees. And that's something that we can help with, of course. And then we take the case to the JID and say, is there anyone here who can help this journalist find a lawyer? So there's two types of support right there. It's important to point out, I think, that in addition to the legal support, the paying of fees, the connecting to a lawyer, there might be other types of support as well that are needed. Legal cases, as Alinda and as my colleagues here have said, can be very complex. They can take a very long time. Harassment, threats, online and offline, might accompany those cases. Trauma support and a support for the family while journalists are going through these cases, while they might be forced to stop working as well. So it's always important to see the legal case in kind of the wider context of journalist safety and assistance as well. Like media defense and Alinda, we have also seen quite a big increase in requests for legal support. In 2019, we supported 13 journalists with fees for legal support. That increased to 18 in 2020, and we are on track to match and perhaps even surpass that number this year. No better way to kind of illustrate the need than journalists getting in touch with us that way. If I could just speak quickly as well about the safety information, because that is another really key aspect of the legal network. So the protest that I mentioned earlier, we had so many requests for how do I safely cover this protest? And this is a global issue as well. What happens if I get arrested? Can I film the police when I am covering this protest? What if someone takes my recording device? Things like that. So we worked with TrustLaw to put together a really fantastic Know Your Rights guide for journalists in the US. Even just basic information like having your press badge on you at all times, how to deal with dispersal and curfew orders. Knowing this information ahead of time, knowing your rights can really protect you when you are out covering high-risk stories. And we look forward to creating more of these excellent resources with the legal network as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucy. And maybe this question is sort of building on what you both said, Alinda and Lucy, for both of you. Where do you see the value of this network? How does it complement your work? You've touched on this to some extent, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you see this filling that gap and how you expect to interact with the network. So maybe we can start with you, Alinda.
Thanks, Carolina. I think the value of the network is in making sure that we coordinate so that the best possible use is made of increasingly scarce resources. So we see, on the one hand, legal cases becoming more complex, more expensive, and more difficult to fight. Like I said, last year we doubled our caseload. On the other hand, the funding environment for organizations, journalist support organizations, is quite challenging at the moment, also as a result of the pandemic. So in that sense, we do need to make sure that we work together as best as we can to coordinate, for instance, the grants we give to local lawyers to make sure that we cover the right amount of legal fees, that we don't inflate local legal fees, which would then potentially hurt other journalists who get into legal trouble and you need to find a lawyer. It's things like that to make sure that we do have a joint response to the deterioration of media freedom.
Thank you, Alinda. And maybe Lucy, if you want to say a few words.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely picking up on what Alinda said, the volume of cases that all our organizations receive can be challenging. So coordinating and spreading the load, as it were, is incredibly helpful. I think, Keelan, when you were speaking about doing that proactive work, that absolutely applies to the guides and those safety resources that I mentioned as well. No one can predict the future, but doing the best job that we can to make sure journalists know ahead of time how they can safely cover something, making sure that all the right steps have been taken in case there is an arrest or detention as well. And certainly with the legal network as well, it goes beyond just that providing of fees and that connecting to a lawyer. It's the different types of support, the raising the profile of a case, the trial monitoring as well, expert testimony in the case of digital attacks, which we are seeing as an increasing problem. So it's really expanding the fantastic work that's already being done and just giving journalists so many more opportunities to access legal support and different types of legal support as well.
Thank you, Lucy. And building on the ways in which it is supportive, it'd be helpful to also talk a little bit about what we expect to be challenges that we might face, right? So figuring out how we can best support in the space that we're in and with the organizations that are members of the network, as well as those that are not. So how we can best support the ecosystem. What challenges would you expect the network to face or the deployment of this type of assistance to face? Maybe we can start with you, Keelan.
Sorry, thanks, Carolina. So I should say, first of all, it's of course very, very welcome to hear today about any initiative to strengthen the ecosystem to defend the media. And I'm very encouraged by, first of all, the point Alinda made about the concept being flexible. So, for example, allowing where appropriate for amicus briefs. I mean, in my experience, quite often, many of the states that we act against in these cases don't like sunlight. They don't like the world watching. And that's why soft measures such as, for example, the UN special rapporteurs making a statement or trial monitoring can be very, very helpful in sending a clear message that the world is watching you. And amicus briefs can be a very powerful tool. So it's very useful to hear from Alinda that that's something that they're looking at, because it's going to depend in every case on the country you're dealing with, the nature of the laws that you're dealing with, and what the journalists themselves want. And amicus briefs are an important tool in our armory, it seems to me, to say the world is watching. Lucy's example as well is a very powerful one about giving training in respect of protests. So an increasing trend that we're seeing is the attacks on journalists at protests and a lack of respect by law enforcement for the role of press at protests. And there's been a line of authority in the European Court of Human Rights about that. And we've obviously seen terrible scenes in the US. This isn't just in countries which are traditionally perceived as non-rule of law compliant countries. I mean, many of the scenes we saw in the US were appalling. But I wanted to also give on that a powerful example in the UK, for those who haven't seen it. Andy Aitchison, a photojournalist, was taking photographs earlier this year at Napier Barracks at an immigration detention centre. And he was arrested, detained, and many months later, thanks to the work of a colleague of mine here at Doughty Street Chambers and some brilliant solicitors at Bindmans, there was an unreserved apology from the Metropolitan Police in London for the way that they had treated him. But bear in mind, this is a country, the UK, which is one of the leading countries in the Media Freedom Coalition. It's a country which had, just weeks before this happened to Andy Aitchison, trumpeted its new plan for the safety of journalists. And yet you have a situation where police officers and prosecutors were entirely unaware that this was an inappropriate way in which to treat someone. So a key thing, as well as training for journalists, so that forewarned is forearmed and they know their rights and they know what to say, another key thing we should be doing is we should be ensuring, in fact, that those who are apparently enforcing the law are also trained to understand these standards so that they don't make mistakes like the mistakes the Metropolitan Police made to Andy Aitchison. In terms of where this fits, it seemed to me there's some very, very good initiatives currently, but I agree very much with Alinda's point about sometimes them being patchy or difficult to access. Can I give two examples for those who are joining about existing initiatives, which I think are particularly strong? One of them is the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, the ECPMF Legal Support Fund for Journalists within Europe, which has provided support on a number of our cases. The procedure is very easy. It's filling in an online form or getting in touch with Flutura at ECPMF. And there's relatively small amounts available, but they can be released quite quickly. So that's a really important, useful, existing initiative. And also it allows people where they have their own choice of lawyer lined up to access some funding if the lawyer is, for example, acting on a low bono basis rather than pro bono. And the other example I'd give is the brilliant Justice for Journalists Fund. And the Justice for Journalists Fund allows for very long-term proactive work to be undertaken. So, for example, we're doing, supported by the Justice for Journalists Fund, a very long-term complex case seeking accountability for the family of Anton Hammerl, a journalist who was killed in Libya in 2011 when there was an attempted kidnap of him with Jim Foley, Claire Gillis and Manu Bravo, of 4 journalists, and he was killed. And that's a complex case which takes many years, and it's simply not possible for it to be done by a commercial solicitor who gives a small amount of their time pro bono and doesn't have expertise. It's got to be done by a committed team over a long period of time. And initiatives like the Justice for Journalists Fund allow that to happen. I would say 2 things in terms of challenges, just to flag at this stage. The first is that working with local lawyers is often key in these cases. But depending on the country in question, one of the challenges we often see with local lawyers is that local lawyers themselves come under pressure. So, for example, if you're dealing with a case in Egypt involving a journalist, it's a very common thing for your own local lawyer in Egypt to also be accused of involvement with the Muslim Brotherhood or offending against national security laws simply by virtue of the fact that they are acting for your client, or simply by virtue of the fact that they're engaging with organizations like CPJ, for example. So that's a very common problem. So I think in some circumstances, we can equip local lawyers and we can work with and supplement local lawyers, and we can fund local lawyers. But often you do need in these cases to have an international element, particularly when you're dealing with a country which is not rule of law compliant or where lawyers locally themselves may come under pressure. And then the other note of caution that I'd sound just is, Alinda quite rightly referred to having to spread around increasingly scarce resources. I'm afraid I do have some concerns about the use in some circumstances of pro bono lawyers who don't have expertise. I've seen some very poor examples in recent years where something has gone wrong from someone well-meaning who thinks human rights is easy to do and something they can pick up. when actually in their day job, they do an entirely different area of law. I'll give you one example. I've had a case very recently where someone made a complaint to a UN treaty body on behalf of a family of a bereaved family of a journalist. And in fact, they had a far, far better mechanism for redress in the European Court of Human Rights. But by virtue of having gone to the UN with a well-meaning pro bono legal team, they actually had undermined the family's ability to get accountability. So I would just say, of course, there's a place for pro bono support. We've got to make sure that we don't plug gaps in a system by using pro bono lawyers who don't have expertise, when in fact you need expertise. And very final thing to say, I know I've taken up a bit of time, is when we spoke about the trends earlier, I agree entirely with Andrea and Alinda and Lucy on the trends they identified. There's just one extra one that I'd note that it worries me a lot. And it's a place where I think this network could be of particular importance in terms of its collaborative work and drawing on expertise internationally. And that is a trend of extraterritoriality. So increasingly what I'm seeing is that threats to journalists and media organizations are not contained within the corners of an individual country, but are reaching out across borders. So we've seen a very high profile example of that this year in relation to Belarus, commandeering a Ryanair plane in order to bring a journalist back within your jurisdiction. But also we've seen, for example, Saudi Arabia assassinating journalists cross-border. We've also seen the very chilling example of Iran. Many of my clients are targeted in London or in Washington by Iran cross-border in an attempt to silence them. And we're coming very close to the 1-year anniversary of the execution of Ruhollah Azam, a journalist in exile in France, reporting on Iran, lured to a meeting with a source, which turned out to be a trap by the Iranian authorities, brought back and executed for his work, simply for being a journalist in Iran. And extraterritoriality is a real challenge for us. Our systems don't work well for us. You can be targeted in this way in a Council of Europe country, and the normal Council of Europe safety platforms don't help particularly because the threat emanates from outside the Council of Europe. And I think this network, we've got to work together in this network and in other ways to challenge that increasing threat of extraterritoriality. That's another creative use, unfortunately, by our enemies of the law against us. And it's another threat which we need to be very creative to counter.
Thank you, Keelan. Some really fantastic points. And I'd love to turn over to you, Alinda, to address perhaps a couple of the points that very validly Keelan raised around engaging local lawyers and around the use of pro bono legal support. Do you want to perhaps try to take a first stab at addressing some of those questions, how we're addressing that as part of the network, and any other thoughts you might have on challenges for the network?
Of course, yeah, thanks so much. I recognize a lot of the things that Keelan mentioned. So our standard practice would be to involve a local lawyer in any case, recognize that as international lawyers, you do not have the expertise to operate in domestic courts all around the world. Also recognize when is a good time to involve pro bono counsel and what would be a suitable way of working with pro bono counsel. So making sure that you have a very diverse team that consists of someone with local legal expertise, with media law expertise, with international human rights law expertise, and perhaps pro bono lawyers who would like to be involved do not do this work on a daily basis, but are very happy to help with the more administrative side of things. And then you can have a really strong team that can achieve quite a lot in landmark media freedom cases. So that is how I would propose the network deals with that. Another thing that sprang to mind while we were having this discussion about the challenges that the network might face was that, of course, we are working through the courts. We are dependent to a certain extent on the level of independence of the local judiciary. And this brings us also to the important work that UNESCO does in training judges and prosecutors to make sure that they understand the arguments that we come up with and understand the importance of protecting press freedom as well. So that is a really nice example of the way in which it kind of all fits together. And we couldn't really do without those trainings and the independence of the judiciary in order to be successful as a network.
Thank you, Alinda. And to build on that, just to note that I think that it is quite important to think about the skills that are needed for these different cases, projects, initiatives. And I think that there's also a role for training, not just of those judicial actors, but of lawyers. There's a dearth of lawyers that have the right expertise to provide support in these cases. And so upskilling lawyers at a global scale to really be prepared to address these matters and provide the needed support is something that I think we expect to do through the network and engaging partners that are developing and delivering these really important trainings. And I'd also say that, building a little bit on what Lucy, you'd mentioned as an example of pro bono legal support to build out resources and tools and guides, know your rights. Those, I think, pro bono legal support can be quite valuable in that context. So it's a matter of knowing where that support is best needed and most appropriate to deploy. And Keelan, one thing that we talked about prior to having this session, I want to briefly touch on this, is the need for different types of specialism now. It sounds like you're now engaging with other types of lawyers than you were previously in defending media freedom.
Yeah, that's quite right, Carolina. And I mentioned earlier the creative use of our enemies, if I can put it that way, of the law. And it means increasingly journalists are facing things like regulatory challenges. They're facing issues in respect of tax, for example. And in respect of that, I think there is a real place for drawing on the expertise of lawyers who maybe traditionally are not in this field. They're not human rights lawyers. They're not media freedom experts, but they may indeed be experts in respect of tax regulation. And I think that can be very, very useful. Now, something where I also think on our side, in terms of proactive work, with being more creative, I'm increasingly working with people who, for example, have got arbitration expertise. Because if you have a situation where a media organization has opened an office in a country which claims to be compliant with international human rights standards, they claim, as many of these countries do, to have freedom of expression in their constitution. They've signed up to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They claim to respect Article 19, but in practice, they do not do that. Not only is that a breach of international standards and often a breach of their own domestic law, quite often it will have meant that the media organization has made an investment under false pretenses. They've invested in the country on the basis that the country is compliant with these standards, and the country then is not. And I think there's a very interesting line of work now developing for people who have investment treaty arbitration expertise. And we may be able to increasingly use investment treaty arbitration. It does also mean that some of the countries which have insulated themselves from being got at through UN treaty bodies, because they simply haven't signed up to the standards which mean you can bring them to the Human Rights Committee, for example. And it's also a way of targeting some of those countries, because some of those countries do see foreign investment as very important. And in fact, they quite often do have arrangements with investment treaties, which mean you can challenge them in that way. So again, it's another example of our enemies being creative and us needing to be creative too. And that involves drawing on lawyers who've got different types of expertise to the traditional types of expertise we normally have turned to in this area.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Keelan. And Andrea, you bring a pretty unique perspective to the conversation, and you oversee the Global Media Defense Fund. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role of the international community in supporting media freedom and initiatives like this one? And is there funding available that is growing or scaling to meet the increasing scale of this challenge?
Thank you. So first of all, I think the international community should, of course, really welcome this kind of initiative, welcome such efforts of coordination, collaboration, networking, and streamlining, like the Legal Network Journalists at Risk, which is the birth today. This coalition-based approach is actually in the spirit of the UN Plan of Action on Safety of Journalists and the Issue of Impunity, which, let me recall, is a plan of action which was developed with and for a wide variety of stakeholders. And of course, each constituency has a role to address these challenges: the judicial actors, the governmental ones, the security forces, as mentioned by Keelan, the civil society, the academia, etc. So this kind of coordination is needed. And of course, we are happy and ready to support any kind of synergy, also with the existing other activities or initiatives. In our case, you mentioned that as part of the spearheading on the UN plan, we have a specific funding instrument, which was created 2 years ago, the Global Media Defense Fund. It was established within the framework of the Global Campaign for Media Freedom, triggered by initial donation from UK and Canada, now joined by over 12 other donors. So this funding mechanism is to support not-for-profit organization, grassroots level, also regional and international level, in upscaling project to bolster journalist legal protection and or also involving strategic litigation. So last year, it distributed grants for over $1.3 million to 40 plus organizations. And the activity has been involving over 170 lawyers around the world, benefiting over 1,700 journalists, involving over 65 civil society organizations. It has been also related to 850 cases of legal assistance, but also very important and relevant to mention here, to the creation of over 10 networks of local networks of lawyers dealing with cases related to freedom of expression, and also about 12 legal units created within media, newsrooms, within media themselves. So really very welcome that now we have this kind of upscale effort to coordinate. We see actually huge potential for this and in synergy with all these activities. And coming to the last part of your question, what are the needs? Is this enough? In our perception, there is a huge need. Allow me to mention that the second call for proposals of this fund, which just has been assessed recently, we received over 150 candidates proposals, so with a 50% increase as opposed to last year, and we'll be in the position to fund just about 40. So the need is there, and this kind of support at a scale manner is much needed. And then, of course, the synergy goes without, and the coordination goes without saying, is a good practice that we should all be committed to. Thank you.
Such important work. And I think that the networks that you've been building locally are really instrumental in deploying an initiative like this, this initiative being successful by building the right communities of lawyers in country. So that's really fantastic, and we look forward to working with them. One last quick question, perhaps for you, Lucy, before I pose a question to all of you. Lucy, even though the network is officially launching now, several of the forms of support and coordination that are going to be offered through the network have been informally deployed this year, over the past year and a half. Can you share perhaps some examples of what has helped CPJ and the journalists you support?
Absolutely. So I'll go back first to that Know Your Rights guide, because I cannot stress enough just how important it is, and also just seeing the questions that we were getting. And it really was quite basic information that I think, if you are part of a big newsroom or a larger newsroom, this is really quite simple information to let your staff know about. For those who are independent media or don't have that traditional support of a larger newsroom, there are lots of resources out there as well. I'd like to highlight just how fantastic and helpful the JID network collaboration has been around a crisis that we are all still working on, which is of course that of Afghanistan. Initiatives like the Legal Network and like the JID come together quickly at these crucial times. And the crisis in Afghanistan, it's ongoing. It happened extremely quickly, and we were lucky enough that we had partners in place that could very quickly and very swiftly help journalists and coordinate together. So in terms of the journalists that CPJ have helped this year, that we continue to help, those are just two very, very good examples of where collaboration has been extremely important, where the information has been able to fill a gap very, very quickly. Going back to Keelan's point, just on those protests as well, and emphasizing the fact that media and press freedom issues and safety threats to journalists can come about very, very quickly. The US Press Freedom Tracker, which is a fantastic resource, last year there were more than 100 arrests of journalists covering those protests. that number in the United States, that number was more than the previous 3 years combined. So again, just showing that there can be a swell of need extremely quickly, and that collaboration is key when that does happen.
Thank you, Lucy. I think it's apparent from all of your remarks that the issue and the challenges that journalists and media organizations are facing is only growing. And I think that we hope that the legal network will be an important tool in the arsenal to defend media freedom and provide this much needed legal support. But it is only one piece of the puzzle. And so there's a broader role for the public, journalists, lawyers, policymakers, funders to play in supporting and protecting media freedom, as you've all alluded to some extent in your remarks. So in one sentence, to kind of close us out, what is your call to action to our audience participants? Let's maybe start with you, Alinda.
Thanks, Carolina. From our perspective, and to end on an optimistic note, I would say if you're confronted with legal action as a result of your journalistic work, don't despair. Know that support is available. So check out the Legal Network website or write to Media Defense directly.
Thanks, Alinda. Over to you, Keelan.
Thanks very much, Carolina. So as I've said a few times during this session, the law is increasingly being weaponized and used against journalists. And we've got to bear in mind that we, as lawyers, and the journalists in the audience who require lawyers, we can and should use the law as a shield in those circumstances, but we also can use the law proactively as a sword. We've got to get creative. I realize that's lawyer says lawyers are needed, which is perhaps not the most attractive point. But there is one other point I want to make, because I'm conscious there's a number of states who are also attending today. And one of the things which is so frustrating when we have these discussions is that there are many states which talk the talk in relation to defending media freedom, but do not walk the walk. Now, when Alinda said earlier, we're dealing with increasingly scarce resources, why are we dealing with increasingly scarce resources? Why are those states who've put their names to the Media Freedom Coalition not stepping up? Why do those countries not all have, for example, funds, proper funds available for specialist legal support in these cases? The vast majority of those countries have zero support available in terms of public funding when journalists face a barrage of spurious defamation cases, for example, like my client Daphne Caruana Galizia did prior to her death. And the bottom line is, what's being done here and what we've talked about here is civil society stepping in to fill a gap, but there should not be a gap. And for members of the audience who are from states, I would ask states to step up and to do far, far more. And we often talk about how some of the mechanisms in place internationally, like the UN special procedures, don't necessarily have bite. And the reason that they don't have bite is because states don't want to get bitten. So my call to action for states would be, we've got to do far more than simply state in principle that you support journalists and that you want to end impunity. It is beyond time for states to provide the kind of support which Alinda, Lucy, and their colleagues are now providing through this new legal network.
Thank you, Keelan. Important call to action. How about you, Andrea?
Thank you. As next year, 2022, we'll have the 10th anniversary of the UN Plan of Action Safety of Journalists in the issue of impunity. I think let's plan to come all together to make out the most of it in terms of impact around the 3 Ps, which are in this plan: prevention, protection, and prosecution. Let's have scale effort also during the World Press Freedom Day Global Conference, beginning of May, hosted by Uruguay. We are waiting you there. We are co-organizer as every year, but also worth mentioning through concrete implementation on the ground, for instance, through the National Protection Mechanism, to the involvement of the widest possible number of stakeholders, including, of course, lawyers, network of lawyers, and such umbrella coordination mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. A concrete and practical call to action, something we can all look forward to. And Lucy, what do you leave us with?
Thank you. I leave you with the call to, for journalists, for newsrooms to please see legal education, legal support as intrinsic to journalist safety. Please contact the Legal Network if you need us. We are more than happy to help. And I would love, if you have questions about how to cover something safely, your rights while covering anything from a protest to something that doesn't involve you going out and putting yourself in that kind of risk, our organizations are here to answer those questions. We want to make sure that you are preemptively prepared. And so please just reach out to us. Legal threats are a huge press freedom issue. So we also encourage newsrooms and journalists to keep shining the light, to report on these issues as well, to make sure that the public is aware of what journalists globally are facing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. Critical public awareness. So with no more time left, I'll just say thank you, Alinda, Andrea, Keelan, Lucy, for joining us today and for the important work that you do advancing media freedom. Never has it been more critical. Looking ahead, I think the next decade is going to be really pivotal for press freedom as we navigate a range of the different crises we've talked about. And collaboration is really going to be instrumental. So we look forward to working with you and hope that everybody that's on the line will join us in this effort. Thank you again for attending, and we encourage you to stay on for the remaining sessions. And you might have a special interest in the upcoming session on journalists under attack, how online and real-world threats risk limiting women's participation in journalism. It's in some ways a continuation of this conversation and talking about some of the critical pieces of online threats and online harassment and the role that gender plays in that. So looking forward to seeing you later on. Thank you very much.